Well, welcome everybody to our Hard Feelings podcast. We are in a season at our church. This theme for the next year is divinely designed, really focusing on each of us is uniquely made and designed by God. And we're going through a series right now, a sermon series called Hard Feelings. So along with that, we have this podcast that we are doing for 5 weeks, really taking a chance to explore different emotions every week. We are so blessed that as a congregation, we have many doctors and counselors and licensed therapists in our midst, and we are just tapping into their knowledge and their expertise for these emotions during this time. And we are thankful today that we have with us Deanna Lazaro, and she will be focusing on fear and anger today. So Deanna, as we get started, thanks so much for being here. Can you give us just a little bit of background on your profession and maybe why you felt led and called into it, maybe your passion behind it?
Sure. So hello, I am Deanna Lazaro, licensed clinical social worker. And also I go to this church. I don't know if that's important or not. Yes. And a member and everything. So I think Evan was asking, how did I end up in this profession? That is quite a long story, but I will keep it rather brief. So when I was first discovering my faith in college, I was thinking about how could I live out my faith in my career. And for me, I felt a calling to go into social work. In fact, I first had the vision to help kids who were in foster care and help them get placements. And I started working for children's agencies. And I very quickly learned that to be most effective in helping kids and their upbringings, I probably needed to work more with the parents. More often than not, when kids are taken from the home, usually there's addiction issues involved and abuse issues. And so if I'm really trying to help the children, I need to go through the parents. So I pivoted my career from working with kids to working with adults. And my current specialty right now is working with people with addictions. Parents are not, just people with adults with addictions. So I hope that answered your question. Yeah,
absolutely wonderful. And thank you for what you do and just your heart behind it. And when we approached you about being on this podcast and leading into this conversation, you had told me specifically that anger is one of your favorite topics to talk about.
Sure.
Say more about that.
Yeah, so when, in fact, I made this commentary to Carla too after her sermon last week. I was like, oh, I love this series. I love that you're talking about anger. Because when clients come into a session or a group therapy, that's one of my favorite things for them to bring it, because people usually come in like ready to talk about at least one thing. And when people come in ready to talk about anger, I like to say it's a treasure trove, because it's really just, as we say in, mental health, we use the metaphor of an anger iceberg. And the idea is when people come in with anger, we're really only seeing like the top, let's call it 10% or so of what's really going on. We're just seeing the effects, of the bigger topics underneath the water coming out through the anger. So when people come in with anger, I'm like, I know there's so much there. Sure. We're going to do a lot of work together. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just to start, as we get into this topic, what is the relationship between fear and anger? I know they kind of go hand in hand a little bit. Do they share a common purpose?
They do, in my humble opinion and expertise, they do share a common purpose, which is protection. So actually, we're filming today on a Sunday, and we just heard a sermon from Carla about fear and how fear is, she was talking about like the fight or flight response. I don't think she actually used those words, but she was, in our limbic system. And, if there's a threat, if there's a danger, we're trying to protect ourselves. Like we pretty much have two options, which is either we're going to fight, which is basically anger, or we're going to flee, we're going to run away, the fear response. We have a few other options like freeze, but the more effective one tends to be about action and response. And then the other relationship that came to mind for me between fear and anger is when we're talking about grief. So oftentimes, like I was saying with the anger iceberg, oftentimes anger is an outward expression of something else going on underneath the surface. And when people are going through the grief cycle for, whether it's somebody has passed or maybe they've, lost a job or whatever the grief is, typically there is a fear underneath that or a deep sadness. And anger just happens to be the most easily accessible emotion to be able to express. Yeah.
So what are primary versus secondary emotions?
Yeah, so let's all imagine a color wheel for a quick moment. We have our primary colors. We have, let me see, red, blue, and yellow. So those are like the colors we start with. And then we have secondary colors, when we start to mix, we get greens and oranges. Anyway, so emotions are kind of like that too. So whatever our first initial emotional response is to something, whether it's a threat, grief, or feeling vulnerable, whatever it is, our first emotional response is our primary emotion. And then if something comes after that, we call that a secondary emotion. All emotions are valid. However, the easiest path to address our emotions is to go through our primary emotions. So there's a phrase we say often in counseling and therapy, which is that anger tends to be a secondary emotion. It's not every single time. However, more often than not, our anger is a secondary emotion. So yet again, the anger being the treasure trove and the door of access to so many other primary emotions to address. Yeah.
That makes so much sense. I've actually never thought about it that way. I've never even heard that. Yeah, that's good. I'm going to have to rewatch this and re-listen and take the notes down for myself. Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like we're already having a session right now. Interesting. A little bait and switch. Kidding. So you touched on this just a second ago, but can you expand a little bit more? What is the anger iceberg analogy?
Yeah. So just to dive into that just a little bit more, everybody's anger iceberg is going to look different. So, if you can envision, I don't know if editing, you guys want to pull up a picture of an iceberg, but some of these go really deep, down into like the dark blue, if you want to say. So when we're talking about what's underneath the anger, some of what's underneath that anger and that anger iceberg might be pretty easy to access. Like I'm feeling unheard, or I feel not prioritized, whatever the situation is. But as you go deeper in the iceberg, it gets more vulnerable. It becomes more about like what our true core beliefs are about ourselves, which some of those might feel really not easy to access. I feel unlovable. I feel not safe in the world, right? So the deeper you go in the iceberg, the more we get closer and closer to our primary emotions and our primary response to situations rather than just going to the anger.
That's good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just a minute ago, you talked about how fear and anger, they appear in the grief journey.
Yes.
Do they also appear in trauma response journey as well? And what does that look like?
Yeah, right. So classic responses to trauma, especially, either when the trauma is immediately happening and we have to respond to it, or after the fact, when we're trying to process what happened. Typically, we have 3 to 4 options of how we respond. And I know Carla mentioned some of these. We have the fight response, we have the flight response, freeze response, and then a fawn response. Freeze and fawn, those two are not so much about action, and they're more about self-preservation. However, the fight and flight response are very much about action. They're like, I gotta move, I gotta get out of here. And then when people are processing trauma, even though the trauma has already happened, typically we can still get stuck in these cycles where we feel like the threat or the trauma is still upon us, even if it has passed and it's no longer present. So hey, go to therapy and learn how to process those. But circling back to talking about the grief journey just for a quick moment. Which is that, when people are going through the stages of grief, and, one thing I wanted to clarify is, sometimes when people hear that there are 5 stages of grief, sometimes people think like, okay, let's go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3.
Yep.
And it is certainly not linear. I like to say it's an ebb and a flow. And as we grieve, because grieving is a never-ending process if we have lost someone or something that we love, But we go through those cycles of our stages of grief over and over again. And first stage of grief is denial. And denial doesn't mean we're delusional, this thing has never happened, I'm in my own daydream. It's not like that. Denial is basically a numbing that we can't quite process what has happened yet, an emotional numbing. And then the very next part of grief, right after we're numb, is anger. So that's the very next known stage of grief. And I like to talk, with clients who are going through a grieving process, because oftentimes they feel a little bit startled by their own anger. They're like, I thought I'd feel sad. I thought I'd feel, completely glum and not be able to get out of bed. But sometimes it's the opposite. That when we move through our numbness or our denial, oftentimes the very first emotion to greet us is the anger. And yet again, circling back to our anger iceberg, it's because it might be the most easily expressible emotion, even if there is quite a lot under there. So.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, that makes sense. Yes. Yeah. So one thing that I do at our church is I lead our men's ministry, and we have a wonderful group of men. So that's my disclaimer. They have great hearts, but with men, it is oftentimes really hard for them specifically to explore any sort of emotion. And not just men, but I know for everybody, especially the topics of fear and anger. Why do you think that those topics specifically are even more difficult for people, not just our men's ministry, but just for people in general to explore and to talk about?
Yeah. And I think too, the topic of anger and anger expression, especially when we're talking about men, is very pertinent. Many people, men especially, grow up with some kind of like, what's it called when you're at a bowling alley and there's like the bumpers or whatever on the sides?
Yes,
It's like, you only get, you can only get a strike, right? So anyway, it's kind of like that with our emotions sometimes where, the acceptable emotions are like pretty narrow. And for men traditionally, being like happy, excited, or angry, like, okay, those ones are like the quote unquote safe emotions. Yeah. So lo and behold, yet again with our anger iceberg, like maybe what's under that is fear or isolation or boredom or whatever. And yet the easiest way to express that is the anger. Well, it's like, okay, so I'm not feeling happy or excited. I mean, I'm just saying a general example here. But maybe, okay, anger is the closest thing to what I actually feel. And so, their emotions may be expressed more towards anger because that's at least close to what I'm feeling, even if it's not a bullseye. Yes. And fear tends to be pretty hard to discuss because talking about fear is pretty vulnerable.
Absolutely.
We're kind of identifying like, I don't feel safe in the world, or I don't feel like my family is safe, or whatever it may be. And I feel pretty fearful about that. That's a pretty vulnerable thing to say, that, like Carla was saying in the sermon today, like I feel out of control, and who wants to admit that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And even just admitting that you're fearful of something, that takes away, on some level of your psyche, it takes away points of strength. And you are giving up points. And again, for men specifically, brought up in a certain culture of this is what it looks like to be a man, and so actually with that mindset, I want to just transition into a little bit of like some biblical context.
Absolutely.
As far as, fear and anger are very evident in Scripture and in the Bible, and as we have learned through our sermon series this fall as well. So where do you see fear and anger show up in the Bible, specifically in the stories about Jesus?
Yeah. Like I said, one of my favorite things to talk about with clients is anger. And back when I used to lead a Bible study, one of my favorite Bible study topics to go over is Jesus's anger. I think we can all recall, I wish I had my Bible right here, but basically when, he rides the donkey into the, Jerusalem, and he goes into the temple, and like the very first thing he says, like, I think think it's from the Matthew account. Like the very first thing he does is flip some tables. Some righteous anger right there because he's upset, rightfully so.
Rightfully so.
Yeah, that his house, God's house was meant to be a house of prayer. It was being turned into something else. His anger, like I was saying, not all anger is a secondary emotion, but quite often it is. However, there are many examples, especially in Jesus's, example of anger that is, a very pure primary anger, and seeing, the temple used that way was, righteous. And then in fear, what came to mind for me was the Garden of Gethsemane. When Jesus knew, this is his last night on earth, he's going to be crucified the very next morning. And he spends time in that fear. Another interesting part about that story is that he calls some of his disciples to watch him go through that fear process as he's battling, with God the Father and praying to him could this possibly be taken from me? Possibly having a flight response, trauma response here. But anywho, who am I to say what Jesus was going through? But quite obviously there was a lot of fear. And it's good to know, at least in my humble opinion, that, Jesus had all the emotions just like we do. And he was asking his disciples to witness them. Watch me pray. Watch me battle with the Father.
Yeah. So I'm just going to go a little off script because I genuinely would love to hear your response to this. I won't go in depth in the whole story, but growing up, I had a close family friend that was shot and killed at a drinking party. And that evening, I wasn't around for it, but I've since heard the victim's father, who I know well, speak about it. He said that evening that happened, you can imagine all the emotions that were going through him.
Well, I don't know if I could imagine all the
absolutely, but none more obvious than anger.
Sure.
And he said, that night I sat there and I didn't know what I was thinking. He said, but the overwhelming thought and prayer that I had in my heart, he goes, I prayed to God. I said, God, don't take the anger away, but take away the destructive anger.
Okay.
Because he goes, my response to that, the boy that killed his son, he said, my response to that, I know if I had it my way, it wouldn't be pretty, in his words. He said, so don't take the anger away, take away the destructive anger. I'd love just your thoughts on that. And that's profound to me. And I still don't know if I understand it, but what is that difference between anger and then the destructive side of anger?
Yeah, so circling back to me working in addiction, because, part of, and then I'll touch on we're going on a journey and then we're coming back. So oftentimes when I'm working with people in addiction, as we go on our healing and recovery journey, I eventually like to give a pep talk about, in the addiction, you developed a lot of skills. They usually fight me on that. Like, what are you talking about? Lying and all that. Anyway, well, you learned a lot of skills because to maintain the addiction, like that took a certain skill set, right? For however many years and so on. So how can we use those powers for good? You know what I mean? Like that hyper fixation and it's like one track mind and moving heaven and earth to, go to the casino or whatever the addiction is, right? It's like, so how can we use those same skill sets, but in your recovery? Yeah. How can we do that to make your life and your community better? Anyway, so I think that when we're talking about anger in this kind of example, I actually think that the friend you were talking about or the friend's dad, he had a lot of wisdom beyond his present moment. Because anger, like we were saying with the trauma response, like it has us move, right? Which is a good thing, if there's something coming at us and we need to fight it, saber-tooth tiger or whatever. Like, let's hope we move. Let's hope that there's somewhere for this anger to channel and go. And so I think, this guy you're talking about, like he had some wisdom beyond like what he could probably see in that moment, probably God-given.
Yes.
to say, like, anger, especially if somebody has lost someone, like that anger, again, like a superpower, can be channeled,
Yes.
toward the things that can make a real difference. Maybe, I don't know if he works for any nonprofits or causes or whatever, volunteers. It's like channeling that anger so that maybe other people are not put in similar situations.
Yeah.
That would be my response.
That's great. No, and him and his wife, they actually started a grief group that's been rolling now
so
for
great.
decades. Yeah. So using that ultimate anger
for movement.
And a purpose. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, first of all, thank you just for all of your time. And if anyone out there is watching or listening and would like to kind of explore some more resources, dive a little deeper into this specific topic, do you have anything that you might recommend?
So many, but I was really narrowing in on what might be applicable, or an easy little bite-sized piece of what to walk away with. So on the topic of anger, oftentimes when people have anger and it's not being expressed, in a healthy manner, it tends to negatively impact their relationships, their families, and so on. So there's a great resource out there from the Gottmans. We say the Gottmans because it's a married couple, John and I believe Julie Gottman. Anyway, they've written a couple different books together, and there's some experts on marriages and conflict resolution. So one book in particular I would suggest is called Fight Right. And it kind of follows this idea of like, okay, anger and wanting to have hard conversations like comes from a very good place, but making sure we're using it to better the relationship rather than destruct the relationship. And then in terms of fear, the name that comes to mind for me, and maybe many of you guys, I think of Brene Brown, and she's a social worker as well, so I'm a little bit biased. But her whole work is actually on, she has a TED Talk called The Power of Vulnerability. If people have not seen that, I believe it's one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. I think it's like several million views. And it's the idea that if we're trying to connect with people and to be our true authentic selves, it takes vulnerability and it takes opening up about our fears. So feel free to watch that TED Talk or look at the plethora of books that Brene Brown has come out with.
YouTube, I'm sure.
YouTube. That's a great resource.
Good. Well, again, Deanna, thank you so much for just your expertise. Thank you for your time. The prayer is that those listening might be working something through in their own lives right now, and just what you're saying right now, even during our own counseling session. I'm gonna play this back and write down my own notes, because this is stuff that at times feels a little taboo. Like we don't touch it very often. So I'm glad as a church we are exploring that during this season. We are just so thankful for people like yourselves that are just living this out and sharing your gifts in this way. So.
Well, thank you for giving me the platform. I'm honestly really excited about this series.
Absolutely. Well, and thank you to all of you who are watching or listening to the podcast. We look forward to having you for our 5 weeks here and exploring all the different emotions. Please check us out, subscribe on our website and on our YouTube channel, and have a beautiful day.